They say a man's true character shows when his back is against the wall. I didn't fully understand what that meant until one night, not too long ago, when my wife told me she had found someone better. That night, I learned two things. First, you never truly know someone, even after 24 years of marriage. Second, I'd had enough of being the man everyone assumed would quietly accept the world crashing down around him. This is how it started. I came home from work after a long day. My job as an engineer doesn't leave much room for drama. Everything in my world is about logic, precision, and control. So you can imagine my confusion when I stepped through the front door to find my wife, Emily, sitting in the living room with her sister, Claire. Suitcases were packed by the door. It didn't take a genius to figure out something was wrong. Emily didn't even look up right away. She just sat there, hands clasped like she was preparing for some kind of big performance. Claire, on the other hand, gave me a smug little smile. That smile told me everything I needed to know before Emily even opened her mouth. "We need to talk," Emily finally said, her voice calm. Too calm. "Then talk," I said, dropping my keys on the counter. She looked at Claire for backup before continuing. "I've been thinking about this for a while, James. You've changed. We've grown apart. And I've met someone." For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. "You met someone?" I repeated, just to make sure. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier now. "Someone who makes me feel alive, who sees me for who I am. He's everything I've been missing." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because sometimes when the absurdity of a situation punches you in the gut, that's all you can do. "Everything you've been missing?" That's rich, Emily. What exactly have you been missing that I haven't given you? Claire, the ever-helpful sidekick, decided to chime in. "James, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Emily deserves to be happy. She deserves a man who can provide the life she wants." That's when the rage hit. I stepped closer, staring down Claire, and then turned back to Emily. "You mean to tell me that after 24 years of me busting my ass for this family, you're leaving because some shiny new toy caught your eye?" Emily had the nerve to nod, like she was doing me a favor by being honest. "It's not just about him, James. It's about us. You've become complacent. You don't challenge yourself. You're okay with where you are, but I want more. I need more." "More?" I shot back. "You mean you need a man to pump your ego and tell you everything you want to hear? I've been out there providing stability while you've been planning an escape with God knows who. And now you're trying to paint me as the bad guy." Emily stiffened, but Claire couldn't help herself. "This isn't about blame, James. It's about moving forward. Emily has made her choice, and you need to accept it." I glared at her, my fists clenched. "Let me make something clear. You can pack your bags and leave with her for all I care, but don't you dare sit there and lecture me about what I need to accept. Emily made her choice, and now I'll make mine." I turned to Emily, my voice calm but laced with ice. "You've been playing me for a fool, but here's the thing. You didn't marry a fool. You married a man who's been paying attention, even when you thought I wasn't. So go ahead. Take your suitcases and your self-righteous sister and leave. Just know this. Whatever fantasy you think you're chasing, it's going to cost you more than you realize." They left that night, but not before I made one thing clear. There would be no coming back. That's how I ended up in the park later that night, sitting in my car with a bottle of whiskey in hand. I wasn't drunk yet, but I planned to be. It wasn't just about drowning my sorrows. It was about figuring out how to handle the aftermath without losing myself in the process. I was staring at the lake, watching the moonlight ripple on the surface, when I heard a tap on the window. A young cop leaned down, his flashlight sweeping over the interior. "What are you doing out here, sir? What does it look like?" I said, holding up the bottle. "I'm enjoying the view and some damn good whiskey." The officer frowned, but didn't move. "Sir, drinking in a parked car isn't exactly a great idea. You planning on driving anywhere tonight?" "No," I said flatly. "This car won't start unless I pass a breathalyzer test and punch in a code. It's foolproof. And right now, I'm feeling like anything but a fool." He paused, his expression softening. "Rough night. You could say that. Wife trouble." I laughed bitterly. If you can call finding out your wife's been cheating on you with some loser she thinks is her ticket to a better life trouble, then yeah, I'm having wife trouble. When Emily and Claire walked out that night, I stayed in the park longer than I should have. The whiskey wasn't helping me think clearly, but I wasn't looking for clarity. I was looking for a way to control the storm raging inside me. Somewhere in the stillness of the lake's reflection, I realized how much of this had been staring me in the face for months. The changes hadn't been sudden. They were subtle, like the creak of a floorboard in the middle of the night, small enough to ignore until it becomes impossible. Emily had always been predictable. She liked her routines. Up early, coffee in hand, scrolling through the news before starting her day. For years, that predictability had been a comfort to me. But then the cracks started to show. At first, it was her spending more time with Claire. They were always close, sure, but it reached a level where I couldn't help noticing. Emily would call her every night, sometimes for hours, and they'd see each other at least twice a week. She'd leave the house with some vague excuse like Claire's going through a tough time, or she needs my support after the divorce. That sounded noble enough, but the pattern never changed, and it felt less like sisterly bonding and more like they were hiding something. The wardrobe changes came next. Emily was never flashy, always practical, preferring clothes that were comfortable over trendy. But suddenly, she was shopping for tight jeans, bright blouses, and heels she hadn't touched since her 30s. I asked her about it once. "Just refreshing my look," she said casually, her tone brushing off the question like it was silly to ask. But then there was the phone, always in her hand, always tilted away whenever I walked by, locked with a passcode she'd never used before. "Who's got you so busy on that thing?" I joked one evening, trying to keep it light. "Just Claire," she answered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It wasn't just Claire. One Saturday morning, she said she was going to yoga. That wasn't unusual. Emily had taken up yoga a few months earlier, but something about her demeanor felt off that day. After she left, I decided to head to the cafe where we used to grab breakfast together. When I walked in, the barista greeted me warmly. "Hey, good to see you. Emily's been coming by a lot on Tuesdays with a friend. It's nice to see her getting out." I froze, my coffee order forgotten. "A friend?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Yeah," the barista replied with a smile. "They seemed close." I just nodded, muttered a quick thank you, and walked out. That planted the first real seed of doubt. A few weeks later, I found a bank statement tucked into her purse when she left it on the counter. It wasn't for our joint account. This was a separate account, one I didn't know existed. The withdrawals were small but consistent, happening every few days. "What's this about?" I asked her, holding up the statement when she got home. Her reaction was effortless, like she'd been rehearsing it. "Oh, just a personal account for projects and little things. Nothing big. I didn't want to bother you about it." The way she said it was smooth, practiced. But I wasn't buying it anymore. That's when I decided to pay closer attention. If Emily thought I was the kind of man who'd let her play games without consequences, she was about to learn differently. The opportunity came on a Friday evening. She told me she'd be meeting Claire for dinner and might be home late. "Don't wait up," she said with a casual wave as she walked out the door. I waited 5 minutes, then got into my car and followed her. It didn't take long to realize she wasn't heading to Claire's. She drove across town to a hotel, one of those high-end places with valet parking and a lobby designed to impress. I parked a safe distance away and watched as she walked inside, her head held high, completely unbothered. About 30 minutes later, Claire showed up. She walked into the hotel with an overnight bag slung over her shoulder, grinning like she'd just won the lottery. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. A red Corvette pulled into the lot, its engine purring like it owned the place. A man stepped out, tall, cocky, wearing the kind of expensive casual clothes that scream, "Wanna be rich." He greeted Emily and Claire with hugs. Not polite, friendly hugs, but something far more intimate. Too close. Too comfortable. I sat there in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. They all disappeared into the hotel together, laughing like this was just another weekend adventure. I didn't follow them inside. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew this wasn't the moment to confront them. I needed more than anger in a hotel lobby. I needed proof. The next morning, they walked out of the hotel together. Emily and Claire were all smiles, their faces flushed with that unmistakable glow of people who think they've gotten away with something. The man, Trey Nelson, as I'd later learn, opened the door of his Corvette for them, playing the perfect gentleman. I snapped a few photos from my car. They didn't notice. That weekend, I barely ate or slept. I kept replaying the images in my mind. Emily's smile, Claire's smug confidence, Trey's self-satisfied smirk. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the humiliation. Emily had turned me into a joke, and she'd dragged Claire along for the ride. But then, the anger took over. By Monday morning, I had a plan. First, I called a private investigator named Ryan Walker. He came highly recommended, a no-nonsense guy who promised results. I handed him the photos, the bank statement, and everything I knew about Trey Nelson. Find out everything you can about this guy, I said. Where he works, who he knows, how he makes his money. I want to know if this is his game. Ryan nodded. You'll have answers by the end of the week. Next, I moved to protect myself. I transferred money out of our joint accounts and canceled every card Emily had access to. I made sure every asset that mattered to me was out of her reach. Finally, I called Samantha. I didn't tell her everything yet, just enough to let her know I'd need her help soon. She didn't ask many questions, just said, "Whatever you need, Dad." By the time Emily walked through the door that evening, I was calm. I watched her carefully, waiting for her to notice the storm brewing in the distance. She didn't. She thought she still had the upper hand. She had no idea her perfect little plan was about to unravel. Emily came home that evening just as casually as she had left. She walked through the door with that same air of confidence, like she was coming back to a man who hadn't spent the past few days putting every piece of her betrayal together. "Hey," she said with a half-smile as she set her bag down on the counter. "Long day." I stayed seated at the kitchen table, nursing a glass of water. I didn't trust myself to drink anything stronger at that moment. I kept my voice calm, almost conversational. "You could say that. You—" She hesitated for a split second, her hand hovering over her bag. "Yeah." Dinner with Claire ran long. You know how we get when we're talking. Her lie was smooth. I give her that. It almost sounded convincing if I hadn't been sitting outside a hotel the previous night, watching her and her sister walk out with their little secret in tow. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. "Funny, I thought you said you'd be home late because of dinner. But the hotel breakfast crowd must have been nice, huh?" The color drained from her face so fast it was almost comical. She froze, one hand gripping the counter for support. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to sound annoyed, but her voice was trembling. "I'm talking about the Marriott. I'm talking about the guy in the Corvette. I'm talking about you, Claire, and that smug bastard acting like you're the stars of some sleazy rom-com. So why don't you skip the act and tell me the truth for once?" She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "It's not what you think, James." That was when I lost my patience. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and slammed my glass down on the table. "Don't insult me by saying that. I sat there and watched you walk into that hotel. I watched you come out the next morning looking like you'd won the damn lottery. So don't you dare stand here and lie to my face." Emily's expression shifted from panic to defiance. "Fine, you want the truth? Yes, I met someone. Yes, I've been seeing him. But this isn't all on me, James. You've been so checked out of this marriage for years. You're content being good enough, but I need more than that. Trey makes me feel alive, like I matter." "Trey?" I repeated, the name tasting bitter in my mouth. "So it's serious enough that you're on a first-name basis now." She rolled her eyes, as if I was the unreasonable one. "I didn't plan for this to happen, okay? But it did. And I wasn't going to keep living in this rut with you. You don't even fight for us, James. You're just there, always content, never pushing for more." I couldn't help but laugh, short, bitter, and humorless. "Oh, you think I'm the problem here? I've been working my ass off to provide a stable life for us, for Samantha. I'm not the one sneaking around hotels and playing house with some low-rent con artist." Emily flinched at that, but she wasn't done. "This isn't just about him. It's about me, about what I deserve. Trey understands me. He listens. Save it." I snapped, cutting her off. "Whatever fantasy you think you've bought into with him, you can have it. But you're going to learn real fast that the grass isn't greener. It's just more expensive." She tried to respond, but I was already walking past her toward the stairs. I needed to get out of that room, before I said something I'd regret later. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent hours pacing the bedroom, replaying her words in my head. I deserved better than this. After 24 years, I wasn't going to let her walk all over me and leave me with the pieces. By the next morning, I had shifted fully into action mode. The first thing I did was call Samantha. "Hey, Dad," she answered, her voice bright but cautious. She must have sensed the tension in mine. "Everything okay?" "Not exactly," I admitted. "I need to talk to you about your mother. It's complicated, but she's been seeing someone." "It's bad, Sam." There was a pause on the other end. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and steady. I knew something was up. She and Aunt Claire have been acting weird for months. "What do you need me to do?" Samantha's loyalty was like a lifeline in that moment. I didn't lay everything out for her. She didn't need the gory details, but I told her enough to make it clear this wasn't a temporary argument. "I need your help sorting some things out," I said. "I've already started locking down our finances, but there are a few other things I need to take care of." "Say no more," she replied. "I'm coming over tonight." The next step was a visit to my lawyer. I laid everything out: Emily's infidelity, the separate bank account, the photos I'd taken at the hotel. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel Harris, nodded thoughtfully as I spoke. "You've already started moving assets?" she asked. "Yes. Accounts are locked down, credit cards canceled. The house is paid off, but I'm not about to let her get more than she's entitled to." "Good," Rachel said. "The more proactive you are, the better. I'll start drafting the paperwork today. This doesn't have to get messy, but if she pushes back, we're prepared." I left her office feeling steadier than I had in days. That evening, Samantha came over with a notebook in hand. "Okay," she said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "Where do we start?" We spent hours going through everything: accounts, documents, even sentimental items I didn't want to lose if Emily decided to get spiteful. Samantha was sharp, methodical, and utterly determined to make sure I didn't get screwed over. "Dad," she said at one point, looking up from her notes, "you're doing the right thing. You've always been there for us. Now it's your turn to fight for yourself." Her words hit harder than I expected. For the first time since all this began, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't anger or grief. I felt resolve. Emily tried to talk to me again the next day, but by then I was done listening. "James, we need to figure this out," she said, her tone almost pleading. "We already have," I replied coldly. "You made your decision. Now I'm making mine. The divorce papers will be ready soon. You can have Trey, Claire, and your fantasy life. But don't expect me to clean up the mess you're leaving behind." She stared at me, her eyes wide, like she couldn't believe I was standing my ground. For once, I didn't care what she thought. She'd made her bed. Now she could lie in it. By the time Friday rolled around, everything was in motion. I had spent the week making sure I was in control of every angle. Samantha had been a rock, helping me sort through paperwork, finalize the last details of my financial preparations, and pack up anything I wasn't willing to leave in Emily's reach. The house was no longer home. It was a battlefield. Every time Emily walked through the door, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. She'd stop trying to talk to me, instead giving me silent, resentful looks. But I wasn't about to let her off the hook that easily. That morning, I got a call from Ryan Walker, the private investigator. "I've got everything you asked for," he said. "You're going to want to see this in person." We met at his office downtown. Ryan laid out a thick folder filled with photos, financial records, and even a few personal details about Trey Nelson that I hadn't expected. "Your wife's boyfriend," Ryan said, "isn't exactly the upstanding gentleman she might think he is." I flipped through the pages, my anger simmering just below the surface. Trey's entire persona was a facade. The Corvette? Leased and 3 months behind on payments. The flashy clothes? Bought on maxed-out credit cards. The career Emily had mentioned? Nothing more than a string of short-term gigs, each ending in burned bridges and whispers about misconduct. But the real kicker was what Ryan found about his pattern of behavior. Trey had done this before. He'd targeted women like Emily, middle-aged, vulnerable, looking for something to fill the void they felt in their lives. He charmed them, used them, and moved on as soon as their money or usefulness dried up. "How many women are we talking about?" I asked, my voice cold. "At least 4 that I could track down," Ryan said. And those are just the ones who left a paper trail. There's a good chance there are more. I clenched my fists, the edges of the folder biting into my palms. Emily had been stupid, yes, but Trey was a predator, and I wasn't about to let him walk away from this unscathed. I left Ryan's office with a plan brewing in my mind. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had already made a few phone calls to set things in motion. Emily was sitting in the living room when I walked in. She looked up from her phone, her expression guarded. "We need to talk," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. She set the phone down slowly. "What now?" "Let's not pretend you don't know," I said, dropping the folder onto the coffee table between us. "That's Trey. The real Trey. Not the version he's been selling you." She hesitated, glancing at the folder, but not reaching for it. "I don't know what you're trying to prove here, James." "I'm proving," I said, leaning in, "that you've been conned. That the man you threw away 24 years of marriage for is nothing more than a broke, manipulative con artist. But hey, if that's what you're into, be my guest." Her face flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about. Trey isn't like that." "Really?" I said, my voice sharp. I opened the folder and began pulling out the evidence. He's 3 months behind on his car payments. His credit cards are maxed out. Every job he's had ends the same way, with him running out of town before the consequences catch up. Sound familiar? Emily stared at the documents, her bravado crumbling with each piece of paper I dropped in front of her. "And just in case you think this is all about me being petty, here's the best part," I said. "He's done this before. You're not special, Emily. You're just another name on his list." For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken. "You're lying," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "You can believe whatever you want," I said, standing up. "But don't come crying to me when this all blows up in your face. I'll be too busy living my life to care." I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked out the door, climbed into my car, and drove to my brother Michael's house. Michael had been waiting for me, a cold beer in hand as I walked in. "So, how bad was it?" he asked, handing me the bottle. "Worse than you think," I said, sinking into the couch. "But it's handled. For now." Michael grinned. "Good, because I've got a little something to make your day better." He pulled out his phone and showed me a video he'd recorded earlier. It was Trey, being escorted out of his workplace by security guards, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "How'd you pull this off?" I asked, laughing for the first time in days. "Let's just say a little birdie tipped off HR about his expense account fraud," Michael said with a wink. I clinked my beer against his. "You've still got that evil streak, huh?" "Runs in the family," he replied. The fallout came faster than I expected. Emily tried to call me several times over the weekend, but I ignored her. I wasn't interested in whatever excuses or apologies she was trying to muster. By Monday morning, the divorce papers were ready. I had them served to her at work, ensuring maximum impact. Samantha, who had been my silent partner through all of this, sent me a text after the papers were delivered. "Mom's freaking out. Good job." But the real satisfaction came later that evening. I was sitting on the back porch, enjoying the peace and quiet, when I got a call from Ryan. "Thought you'd like to know," he said. "Trey's been served with a cease and desist order from one of his former marks. Looks like his past is catching up to him." I smiled. Good. Let him drown in it. By the end of the week, the house was finally empty. Emily had moved out, taking only what was hers, and the silence was almost deafening. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than anger or bitterness. I felt free. Samantha stopped by that evening with dinner in hand. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her expression thoughtful. "You okay?" she asked. "Better than okay," I replied. "It's going to take time, but I'll get there." She smiled, raising her glass in a toast. "Here's to a fresh start, Dad. You've earned it." I clinked my glass against hers, a sense of peace settling over me. Emily had made her choice, and so had I. For the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to the future. The days after Emily moved out were quieter than I expected, but that silence carried a weight. It wasn't just the absence of her presence. It was the knowledge that she was still clinging to whatever fantasy she had wrapped herself in with Trey. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. She'd made her choice, and I had made mine. But life has a way of dropping surprises when you least expect them. One afternoon, About a week after she left, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was spam, but the text caught my attention immediately. "You don't know me, but we need to talk about Trey Nelson." Attached was a photo of Trey with another woman, a pretty blonde who looked to be in her mid-30s. She had her arm around his waist, and the two of them were grinning like they didn't have a care in the world. Before I could respond, another text came through. "My name is Lisa. I'm his ex-fiancée. Let me guess. He's charming your wife, right? Call me if you want the real story." Underneath was a phone number. I stared at the screen, my gut twisting. I didn't want to call her. I didn't want to dredge up more of this mess. But curiosity won out in the end. I dialed the number, and Lisa picked up on the first ring. "James?" she asked, her voice sharp but steady. "Yeah," I said. "I got your message. What's this about?" "It's about Trey," she said, her tone hardening. "You're not the first guy he screwed over, and you won't be the last. I figured you might want to know what you're dealing with." I sat down, gripping the phone tightly. "I'm listening." Over the next 20 minutes, Lisa laid it all out. She and Trey had been engaged 3 years ago. At first, he seemed perfect, charming, attentive, and full of big plans for their future. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. "He's a professional liar," Lisa said. "Everything about him is a facade. The fancy car, the expensive dinners, the big talk. It's all smoke and mirrors. He used my money to fund that lifestyle until there was nothing left. When I started asking questions, he got defensive, then angry. And when I finally confronted him with the truth, he disappeared, just packed up and left without a word." I could feel the anger boiling under the surface as she spoke. "How much did he take you for?" I asked. "Too much," she said bitterly. "He maxed out my credit cards, drained my savings, and even pawned some of my jewelry. I filed a police report, but he covered his tracks well enough that nothing stuck. I've been keeping tabs on him ever since, hoping to warn the next person before it's too late." She paused, and her voice softened slightly. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this. I know how hard it is to realize someone you trusted is being played like this." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. "Thanks for telling me. Do you have any proof of what he did to you?" "Plenty," she said. "Bank statements, emails, even a couple of recorded calls where he slipped up and admitted to using my money. I'll send you copies." When we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. Emily had thrown away our marriage for a man who was nothing more than a con artist. And now, armed with Lisa's information, I finally had the leverage I needed to bring him down. That evening, I met with Samantha at her apartment. She greeted me with a hug, a concerned look in her eyes. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked. "Better than okay," I said, handing her my phone. "Take a look at this." She scrolled through the photos and messages Lisa had sent, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to anger. "This guy is unbelievable," she said, shaking her head. "What are you going to do?" I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I'm going to make sure he gets exactly what's coming to him." The plan came together quickly. With Lisa's help, I compiled a detailed dossier on Trey's past. It included everything from financial records to testimony from other women he'd scammed. I also reached out to Ryan, who had gathered enough dirt on Trey to ensure he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of this one. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. On the morning I planned to confront Trey, I got a call from Rachel, my lawyer. "I've been reviewing some of the evidence you sent over," she said. "Did you know Trey is already under investigation for fraud in another state? If we turn this information over to the authorities, it could be the nail in his coffin." I didn't hesitate. "Do it." Later that day, I showed up unannounced at the restaurant where Trey had taken Emily on their first date. I knew he'd be there. Lisa had tipped me off about his habits, and sure enough, I spotted him at a corner table, charming another woman who looked too dazzled to notice the lies spilling out of his mouth. I walked up to the table, dropping the folder onto the white tablecloth. "Enjoying yourself, Trey?" I asked, my voice steady but sharp. His smile faltered, and he glanced nervously at the folder. "Do I know you?" "You should," I said. "I'm the husband of the woman you've been stringing along. The one you told would never find anyone better. Ring any bells?" The woman across from him looked confused, her gaze darting between us. What's going on? She asked. I ignored her, keeping my eyes locked on Trey. Go ahead, open it. I'd love to see the look on your face when you realize how much trouble you're in. Trey hesitated, but curiosity, or maybe arrogance, got the better of him. He opened the folder, flipping through the pages. His face went pale. You can't prove any of this, he said, his voice shaking. Oh, I think I can, I said, leaning in. And even if I couldn't, the cops will. They're already looking into you. By the time they're done, you won't have a pot to piss in or a rock to crawl under. Trey's bravado crumbled. He pushed back from the table, muttering something about needing to leave, but I wasn't done yet. Oh, and one more thing, I said, raising my voice enough for the rest of the restaurant to hear. You might want to start thinking about who's going to bail you out when they come knocking. The woman he'd been charming stared at him in shock, then grabbed her purse and stormed out. Trey didn't even try to stop her. As I watched him slink out of the restaurant, a weight lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The fallout was swift. Trey was arrested a few days later on charges of fraud and theft. Emily, faced with the undeniable truth of who he really was, tried to call me, but I didn't pick up. She was on her own now, just like she wanted. Samantha and I celebrated that night with a quiet dinner at her place. As we clinked glasses, I couldn't help but smile. Here's to fresh starts, I said. To fresh starts, she replied. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The fallout from Trey's arrest hit Emily harder than I expected. I didn't hear from her directly. Not at first, but word has a way of traveling in a town like ours. Samantha told me Emily had moved into Claire's place, a 2-bedroom condo that suddenly felt a lot smaller now that their grand plans had collapsed around them. Apparently, Trey's arrest had made headlines. Not major news, but enough for anyone paying attention to learn about his fraudulent schemes and long list of victims. Emily couldn't walk into a grocery store or grab her morning coffee without overhearing whispers about the woman who fell for the con man. For once, I didn't feel any satisfaction in her suffering. The anger that had fueled me for so long had finally burned out, leaving only a quiet sense of closure. Emily had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. One evening, just as I was sitting down to dinner, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Emily. Can we talk? I stared at the screen, my appetite vanishing. Part of me wanted to ignore her, but another part, curiosity, maybe, wanted to hear what she had to say. After a moment, I replied, I'll listen, but I'm not coming to you. If you want to talk, meet me at the park tomorrow at 2. She agreed. The next day was cold and overcast, the kind of weather that felt fitting for what I knew would be a heavy conversation. I arrived at the park a few minutes early and sat on one of the benches overlooking the lake. Emily showed up right on time, wrapped in a coat that looked a size too big, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She looked thinner, worn down. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Thanks for meeting me, she said, sitting down at the other end of the bench. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence sit between us, waiting for her to say what she'd come to say. I owe you an apology, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I was selfish, James. I let myself get caught up in something I thought would make me happy, and I didn't stop to think about the damage I was doing to you, or to myself. I studied her carefully. She sounded genuine, but I wasn't ready to let her off the hook that easily. And I prompted. And I was wrong, she said, looking down at her hands. Trey wasn't who I thought he was. He used me, just like he used Claire, and God knows how many others. I was so blind to it, and now I'm paying the price. I let out a bitter laugh. That's the thing, Emily. You weren't blind. You made a choice. You saw what you wanted to see because it was easier than admitting you were throwing away 24 years for a fantasy. She winced but didn't argue. You're right, she said after a long pause. I have no excuse for what I did. I don't know how to fix this. I shook my head. You can't. There's no going back from this, Emily. You crossed the line, and there's no erasing it. The best thing you could do now is own up to what you've done and figure out how to move forward. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, James, for everything. I stood up, pulling my coat tighter against the wind. I believe you, I said, but an apology doesn't change what happened. Take care of yourself, Emily. And with that, I walked away, leaving her sitting there by the lake. Over the next few months, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Samantha and I grew closer than ever, and her relationship with Gary, the young officer who had been there during some of my darkest moments, started to blossom. Watching her find happiness gave me a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. As for Emily, I heard through the grapevine that she and Claire had started keeping to themselves. Whatever bond they'd shared with Trey had shattered, leaving them to pick up the pieces of their own lives. I didn't wish her ill, but I didn't waste time worrying about her either. For the first time in years, I was focused on myself, on rediscovering the parts of me that had been buried under the weight of a failing marriage. One evening, as I was packing up some old boxes in the garage, I came across a stack of photo albums. They were filled with pictures from our early years, vacations, holidays, moments of joy that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. I sat there for a long time, flipping through the pages, letting the memories wash over me. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance of what had been and what could never be again. By the time I closed the last album, I felt lighter. It was as if letting go of those memories had made room for something new, something better. The turning point came a few weeks later when Samantha invited me to dinner at her place. When I arrived, I was surprised to find Gary there as well, standing at the grill and chatting with Samantha like he'd been part of the family for years. "Hey, Mr. Carter," he said with a grin, flipping a steak. "Samantha said you like yours medium rare." I couldn't help but smile. "You're learning fast, Gary." As the evening went on, I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. Samantha was happy, Gary was good for her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the weight of the past was finally lifting. When I left that night, Samantha hugged me tightly. "You're doing better, Dad," she said. "I can see it." "I am," I replied, and for once I meant it. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild. I took up old hobbies I'd abandoned over the years, spent more time with friends, and even started considering the possibility of dating again. Not to fill a void, but because I finally felt ready to open myself up to something new. Emily remained a part of my past, a chapter that had closed for good. I didn't hate her, but I didn't miss her either. She had taught me a painful lesson, but one that had ultimately made me stronger. As I sat on my back porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Life had thrown me a curveball, but I'd hit it back with everything I had. And now, as the breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and the sounds of laughter echoed from a nearby house, I couldn't help but smile. The future was wide open, and I was finally ready to embrace it.